There's a photograph. It hangs in the east corridor of Ashford Hall, just past the third sconce, at the exact height where a 9-year-old boy would meet it eye to eye. A portrait, oil on canvas, gold-leafed frame. A man in military dress, jaw like a ship's prow, eyes that have never entertained doubt. The plaque beneath reads, Field Marshal the Duke of Car-Renwick, 1887 to 1951. He did not bend. His great-great-grandfather. The boy who used to stand in front of that painting, hands in his pockets, school shoes scuffed, hair never quite cooperating, was named Edmund Ashford Castle. Heir apparent to one of the oldest hereditary titles left in England. Future Duke. Future Field Marshal, presumably. Future man whose jaw would set just like that. He used to stare up at the Field Marshal and think, I hope he's comfortable in there. It looks cold. That's not a thought a future Duke is supposed to have. Nobody told Edmund this directly. Nobody had to. I was his tutor for 4 years, history, rhetoric, a bit of Latin when he'd let me get away with it. I came to Ashford Hall in the autumn he turned 12, hired by the Duchess on the recommendation of a colleague at Oxford. The hall itself sits in Wiltshire, 40 minutes from Salisbury, which sounds pastoral and romantic until you've spent a November there and realized that the wind comes off the downs like it has a personal quarrel with you. The house is enormous in the way that stops meaning anything after a while. You stop seeing the ceilings. Edmund I noticed immediately, which wasn't a given. Quiet children have a way of not being noticed, and Edmund had elevated quietness to something close to an art form. But, on my first morning, I was lost trying to find the library. There were 3, which nobody had thought to mention, and I turned a corner in the south wing and nearly walked into a boy sitting on the floor with his back against the wainscoting, reading. Not a textbook. The Complete Far Side. He looked up. He did not look startled. He looked, if anything, faintly resigned, the way people look when the train they wanted pulls away just as they reach the platform. You must be the new tutor, he said. I must be, I said. The library's the other way. All 3 of them. He paused, turned a page. The one with the atlases smells better. That's the one I'd start with. I took his advice. We got along fine after that. The thing you need to understand about Edmund, and I'm telling you this because nobody who writes about families like his ever gets it right, is that he wasn't miserable. He wasn't a tortured heir or a brooding young lord staring out rain-streaked windows. Those stories are satisfying because they're clean. Edmund wasn't clean. He was more complicated and more ordinary and, in my experience, much harder to write about because of it. He was funny. That was the first thing, and the thing people always forgot. Dry as chalk dust, fast enough that you'd miss it if you blinked. He had a way of saying something so deadpan that it took you 3 full seconds to realize you'd been made to laugh, and, by then, he'd already moved on, face completely composed, as if he hadn't done anything at all. He was also, and I mean this precisely, kind. Not performed kindness. Not the gracious manner drilled into you kind. The kind that watches. He noticed when the kitchen staff were having a hard week. He noticed when I was tired. He would simply, without comment, appear with a cup of tea at the right moment and set it down and say nothing, which is actually the highest form of kindness and is considerably rarer than people think. And he was, by every visible metric, being prepared to lead. Elocution. Posture. Estate management. The history of the title, the properties attached to it, the parliamentary duties that would eventually fall to him. Languages, French and German at minimum, Mandarin encouraged. Writing, of course. Shooting. A working knowledge of the army regiment that bore the family name. How to enter a room. How to leave one. How to speak to a prime minister and a groundskeeper using the same eyes even if not the same words. He did all of it. He was good at most of it. He hated exactly none of it, which was the problem. Hating it would have been simpler. Hatred is useful. Hatred tells you something about what you want instead. Edmund didn't hate any of it. He performed all of it with a kind of careful, courteous competence, like a pianist who plays every note correctly and never once makes you feel the music. I noticed this in our second month together, during a rhetoric session. We were working on formal address. I'd asked him to deliver a short prepared speech, something about the history of the estate, the kind of thing he'd be expected to say at 100 functions across the next 50 years. He stood up. He delivered it. It was technically flawless. Every pause in the right place. Every emphasis where it belonged. Posture from the portrait in the corridor. When he sat down, I said, "What do you actually think about the estate?" He looked at me. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you're not giving a speech about it. When you're just thinking." "What do you think?" A long pause. Long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "I think," he said carefully, "that the roof in the east wing is going to cost £300,000 to fix. And I think the groundskeeper, Perkins, has been covering a dry rot problem in the stables because he's afraid of getting sacked, which is going to make it worse. And I think the family history is interesting, but the way we tell it leaves out an embarrassing amount." He said this to the table. Not to me. "Leaves out what, specifically?" I asked. He looked up. There was something in his face, not quite discomfort. More like, "I know where this hallway leads and I'm not sure I should walk down it. The parts where people like us did things they shouldn't have," he said. "The parts that explain why certain villages feel a particular way about the Ashford Castle name. The parts you can't put in the speech." I didn't say anything. "The field marshal," he said, "the one in the portrait, there's a town in County Antrim. You won't find Ashford Castle in the tourist literature, but you'll find it if you look." He made decisions in 1921 that he stopped. Tapped his pen against the table once. They were decisions a man makes when he believes the title justifies the man, instead of the man having to justify the title. He was 12 years old. I went home that evening and sat in my car in the lane for about 7 minutes before I could quite bring myself to drive. The Duchess Edmund's mother was not a cold woman. That's important to say because cold is the word people reach for, and it's wrong. She was precise. There's a difference. She had organized her emotions the way you organize a wardrobe, everything in its proper place, accessible when needed, not left lying around where it could trip someone. She loved Edmund. That was visible in the way she watched him across rooms, a particular alertness, a readiness, like a person who has positioned themselves to catch something should it fall. But she also needed him to be ready. The title. The estate. The responsibilities. The name. These were not abstractions to her, they were the architecture of a life, and you don't argue with architecture, you learn to live in it. "He's sensitive," she said to me once, at the end of my first year. We were in the morning room, she was reviewing correspondence. She said it the way you might note that a sports car has a temperamental engine, not a flaw exactly, but something requiring management. "He's perceptive," I offered. She glanced up. Something moved briefly through her expression, not irritation. More like recognition, the kind that costs something. "Yes," she said. "That too." She went back to her letters. I understood in that moment that she knew everything I knew about Edmund. Probably more. And that knowing it and not knowing what to do with it amounted, in the life she was living, to the same thing. The summer he turned 14, Edmund asked me, in the particular way he had of asking things, which was to drop them into conversation like they were trivial and, then, watch carefully whether I thought a person could do a job they weren't suited for and still do it well. We were in the Atlas Library. Rain on the skylights. The good kind of afternoon, the kind that makes staying inside feel like permission rather than defeat. "Depends on the job," I said. "What if the job is inherited?" He said the word like it was in a language he was still learning. "What if there's no other applicant? What if you're it?" "Then, you do it," I said. "And if doing it means being someone you're not?" Everyone who leads anything becomes someone slightly different from who they started. That's not unique to you. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a jackdaw landed on the stone balustrade, looked at the window, decided against it, left. "What if the gap is bigger than slightly?" he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at one of the atlas's old, vellum pages, hand-drawn coastlines that got the continents almost right. He ran one finger along a coast that wasn't labeled. "What if you look at the man in the portrait," he said, "and you can't find any of him in yourself? And you've been looking for a while." I didn't answer him right away. The rain came harder. The skylight drummed. "Edmund," I said. "What do you want to be?" The question landed in the room like something dropped. He didn't answer it. He closed the atlas. He stood up. He said, very quietly, "I want to be useful." "Is that enough?" He left before I could tell him that useful was everything. That useful was more than the portrait in the corridor had ever been. That a man who notices the dry rot and the village in County Antrim and the kitchen staff having a hard week is worth more than 10 field marshals with their perfect jaws. I didn't say any of it. I should have. That was part 1. He was 14. He was being built into something. And, somewhere underneath the elocution and the estate management and the portrait's long shadow, there was a boy who read The Far Side on corridor floors and made tea appear at the right moment and asked questions about gaps that were bigger than slightly. The question he left unanswered in the Atlas library would take him another decade to answer. Not because he didn't know. Because the answer scared him more than the portrait ever had done. I didn't see Edmund for 3 years after I left Ashford Hall. Oxford pulled me back. A book. The ordinary machinery of a life that wasn't his. We exchanged letters, actual letters, not emails, because Edmund had decided at some point that emails were for logistics and letters were for things that mattered, and I didn't argue with him. His letters were good. Precise without being airless. Funny in the particular way that makes you read a sentence twice to make sure you caught it all. He wrote about the estate. About the roof repair, which had proceeded catastrophically and, then, been fixed at double the original estimate. About Perkins the groundskeeper, who had finally confessed to the dry rot and been kept on anyway because Edmund had told his mother that loyalty was worth more than the cost of the timber, and his mother had looked at him for a long moment and said, "You're probably right," which she described as the closest thing to a standing ovation he expected to receive from her on the subject. He wrote about his younger sister, Margot, who was 8 and had apparently decided she was going to be either a marine biologist or the first person to domesticate a badger, and Edmund was supporting both ambitions with equal sincerity. He wrote about everything except how he was. That was how I knew how he was. The letter that changed the register came when he was 17. It was shorter than the others. The handwriting was the same. Edmund's penmanship was absurdly good, the product of a governess who had treated illegibility as a moral failing, but the sentences were different. Less constructed. They had a different weight. "I've been thinking about the thing you asked me," he wrote. "In the library. What I want to be. I think I'd been answering the wrong question. I've been asking myself what I want to do. The land, the estate, the duties, whether I could make something of them, whether I could do them well enough that the doing would eventually feel like belonging. That's not the same question. The question is whether I am, at some level, the kind of person the role needs. And I don't know what to do with a question I can't answer by trying harder." He signed off the way he always did, E, below the signature, in smaller script, clearly added after, "I hope the book is going well. And I hope you're getting proper sleep. You had a tendency not to." Even at 17, in the middle of an existential crisis, he was checking whether you'd slept. I went back to Ashford Hall that following Easter. His mother had asked me. She was planning a series of tutorials on political history ahead of Edmund's first formal public duties and wanted my input. But I think she also wanted a set of eyes she trusted. She didn't say this. She wouldn't. But I understood the ask underneath the ask. Edmund was taller. That sounds obvious. 3 years, of course he was, but, I mean, he occupied space differently. He'd grown into his father's height and his mother's posture and the particular stillness that Ashford Hall seemed to generate in its inhabitants over time, like a frequency you absorbed through the floorboards. He looked, from across the entrance hall when I arrived, exactly like the thing he'd been raised to be. Then, he crossed the room, shook my hand, and said, you've cut your hair. It's an improvement. I hope nobody told you that in a way that implied the previous situation was your fault. There he was. We resumed sessions, but they were different now. He was 17, not 12. The gap between what he knew and what I could teach him had narrowed considerably, and what remained was less instruction and more conversation, I suppose. He was preparing for his first proper public speech, an address at a foundation dinner in London, 400 guests, the kind of room where the silverware costs more than a reasonable car. We worked on it for 2 weeks. The speech was fine. Technically, again, without fault. The right notes of gravity and warmth, a self-deprecating line in the second paragraph that would land cleanly, the kind of close that left people with something to hold on to. I told him it was good. It sounds like someone else, he said. Which someone? He gestured loosely at the corridor. At the portrait, by implication. At the whole accumulated weight of Ashford Castle public presentation going back through generations. Someone who's never been uncertain, he said. Someone who's never stood in front of a room and thought, I'm not sure I've earned this chair. No one in that room expects you to have earned it, I said. You were born to it. That's the entire premise. I know. He said it flatly. Not bitterly. Flat the way a road is flat. That's the part one can't figure out. He stood at the window. The Wiltshire Downs beyond, that particular shade of green that has no equivalent elsewhere, a green that knows exactly what it is and has known for 10,000 years. Being born to something isn't the same as being made for it, he said. I've thought about that a lot. The portrait in the corridor was born to it and believed himself made for it, and that belief is what put a village in County Antrim in the history books in the wrong way. So what's the alternative? I asked. You walk away? He turned from the window. No, he said, and the flatness was gone. Something harder under it. I don't walk away. That's not what I'm saying. I'll do it. I'll do all of it. I'll do it better than the portrait, if I can. But I want to do it as myself. And I don't know if that's allowed. Who decides what's allowed? I said. He looked at me like the question was slightly unfair. Everyone, he said. The whole system. The expectation. The role doesn't bend to fit the person. The person bends to fit the role. What if you refuse to bend? A pause. Then, I'd break something, he said. Or the role would. And I don't know which one survives that. The dinner was on a Thursday in March. I wasn't there. But Edmund wrote to me the following week, and this letter was different again, longer, the handwriting slightly looser, like something had released a fraction. I did something I hadn't planned, he wrote. In the speech. At the end, you'll remember I had the close about the foundation's legacy, the work carried forward, etc. I cut it. In the room. I just didn't say it. Instead I said this, which I'm writing from memory, so forgive the approximation. My family has held a certain kind of responsibility for a very long time. I've spent most of my life trying to understand what that means, not in the official version, which I could recite in my sleep, but in the real one, which is harder and less tidy. I've come to think that responsibility held without honesty is just performance. And I've decided I'd rather be honest and occasionally wrong than polished and reliably hollow. I don't know if that qualifies me for the chair I'll eventually inherit. But it's what I'm bringing to it. The room was quiet, he wrote. The kind of quiet that could mean several things. Then, the man to my left, old, late 70s, he'd known my grandfather, started clapping. Slowly. And then, the room did. I don't know if that was approval or polite relief, he wrote. But it felt like the first time I've spoken in public and not felt like a ventriloquist's dummy. E.P.S. The silverware was extraordinary. I thought you'd want to know. That was the beginning of the crack. Not a break. Not yet. Edmund wouldn't break, he wasn't built for breaking, whatever he feared. But the crack was there. The place where the performance and the person stopped sealing perfectly flush. Where you could, if you pressed lightly, feel the gap. I think he'd been afraid the crack would let everything collapse. What it actually did was let air in. That distinction took him a while longer to learn. His mother called me 2 days after the dinner. I'd been half expecting it. He deviated from the speech, she said. I know. A pause. In the background, Ashford Hall's particular silence, old stone, good carpets, all that absorbed history. It was, she stopped. Good? I offered. Another pause. Longer this time. It was him, she said finally. Which, from the Duchess, was everything. The year Edmund turned 18, his father died. I'm not going to describe it in detail. That's not my story to tell in that way. What I'll say is this: it was the thing that was always coming, because the Duke had been ill for 2 years in the particular quiet way that families manage when the alternative is panic, and, when it arrived in the February, which is the worst month for it, grey and relentless and offering nothing to look at except itself. Edmund became, in that moment, the heir apparent of record. The letters arrived from solicitors and estate managers and the family's parliamentary contacts and the regiment. The machinery engaged. It knew exactly what to do. Edmund stood in the entrance hall on the morning of the funeral and looked at the portrait of the field marshal. I know because Margot told me. She'd been watching from the stairs, and he stood there for a long time, and then he went and did everything that needed doing, with the same careful, competent grace that he'd always brought to everything that needed doing. But, Margot said, his face, during that long moment with the portrait, looked like a conversation. Like he was arguing with it. Like he was winning. He wrote to me a month later. The shortest letter he ever sent. I think I've worked it out, he wrote. What I want to be. It took something I wouldn't have chosen as the occasion for working it out. But I want to be the version of this that the role has never had. Not because the others were wrong. But because the world the role exists in has changed, and a role that doesn't change with it is architecture for its own sake. Which is beautiful and useless. I want to be useful. You told me once that was enough. I think you were right. I think I'm ready to test it. E. At the bottom, in that smaller script, the Badger project has stalled. Margot is redirecting toward otters. I've expressed full support. Some things you just don't argue with. The investiture of Edmund Ashford Castle as the 9th Duke of Car-Renwick took place on a Tuesday in June, 2 years after his father's death. They waited, at Edmund's request, until the estate accounts were in order, the east wing roof had held through 2 winters, and the dry rot in the stables was fully remediated. His solicitor had gently noted that none of these were customary prerequisites for an investiture. No, Edmund had said. But, they're mine. The solicitor had written this down, with the particular expression of a man who has encountered something outside his taxonomy but is too professional to say so. I was there. I want to be clear that I was not there in any official capacity. Edmund had sent me an invitation that said, simply, you should come. You were there for most of the building. You may as well see the structure. And, then, below, there will be adequate tea. I've ensured it. Adequate tea. After everything. The ceremony itself was held at Ashford Hall, not in London, another deviation from custom that generated a certain amount of correspondence in formal circles. Edmund's position, as I understood it, was that the title was tied to the land, and the land was in Wiltshire, and conducting the ceremony anywhere else would be an abstraction he wasn't willing to perform. Nobody argued with this successfully. The great hall had been opened for the first time in years. It smelled of beeswax and old stone and something underneath both of those things, time, maybe, or the particular atmosphere of a room that has held a lot of weight across a lot of centuries and has learned to carry it without complaint. The portraits were everywhere. It was unavoidable, they covered the walls in chronological sequence, a visual genealogy of men with the same bone structure and different expressions of certainty. The field marshal, of course. The second duke, in his judge's wig. The fifth, who had apparently done something notable at Balaclava and wanted everyone to know it. Generation after generation of careful oil-painted confidence. Edmund stood in front of them as the guests assembled. Not for long. Just a moment. His back to the room, hands loose at his sides, looking up. Margot appeared at my elbow. She was 20 now, willowy and particular, the kind of young woman who makes you feel slightly examined even when she's being warm, which she always was. He does that, she said quietly. Talks to them. I've heard. He's told me what he says, once. To the field marshal specifically. She paused. He says, I know what you cost. I'm going to make it worth something. She said it simply. Not like it was extraordinary. Like it was just a thing her brother did, which it was. The room filled around us. I watched Edmund turn away from the portraits and begin moving through the guests, the estate tenants, the foundation trustees, the parliamentary colleagues, the regiment officers, the woman from the village in Wiltshire who ran the food bank that Edmund had been quietly funding for 3 years without attaching his name to it, because he'd decided that attaching his name to it would be about him rather than about the food bank. He moved through all of them the same way. Not uniformly. Not in the diplomatic glaze way that means you've been trained to appear equal while feeling nothing in particular. He moved through them specifically. He remembered the groundskeeper Perkins's wife had been ill. He asked. He remembered the name of the regiment adjutant's daughter who'd just started secondary school. He asked about her. He said something to the woman from the food bank that made her laugh, a real laugh, the startled kind, and then he moved on before she could feel observed. The Duchess watched him from across the room. Her expression was not the alert readiness I remembered, the watching to catch if it falls. It was something I hadn't seen on her before. It was relief. The full-body kind. The kind that accumulates over years and releases all at once. The ceremony was short. Edmund had stipulated this. The previous Duke's investiture had run to 3 hours and included 4 speeches and a performed reading from the estate charter dating to 1387. Edmund had reduced this to the essential legal and historical elements, approximately 40 minutes, with 1 speech from himself. He hadn't shown it to me in advance. He hadn't shown it to anyone, as far as I could tell. Which was, in itself, information. He stood at the reading lectern, same one that had been used in this room for generations, walnut, slightly tilted, a small groove worn by many sets of hands, and looked out at the room for a moment before he began. He looked, I thought, like someone who had made a decision and was standing in it. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, he said. No preamble. No formal address. Straight into it. Inheriting something this old, this complicated, from someone you loved, it's not easy, and I think pretending otherwise would be an insult to everyone in this room who knew my father and knows what's been lost. The room was very still. I also want to be honest about something I've spent a long time figuring out. He paused. I was raised for this. That's the truth. And I was raised for it in the full sense, the language, the history, the duties, the expectations. I know what this title has been. I know what it has required, and what it has cost, and I know the ways it has served the people connected to it and the ways it has failed them. I heard someone in the row ahead of me draw a slow breath. I spent years, Edmund said, trying to understand whether I was the right person for it. Whether I fit. Whether, if you pressed the air and the title together, the shape would match. A brief pause. Something wry moved through his face. It doesn't, quite. I think that's all right. I think an exact fit would mean the role had stopped being a living thing and become a relic. And I'd rather it live, even awkwardly. He looked down at his notes, then back up. Barely used them. What I can offer is this: I will do this work as myself. Not as a performance of what this title has always looked like. As the person I actually am, with the judgment and the failures and the specific way of looking at the world that I seem to be stuck with. A pause, dry and deliberate. I'll try to make that an asset. I don't promise I'll always succeed. I promise I'll tell you when I haven't. He folded his notes. I am grateful, he said, for every person in this room. And, for the ones who aren't here. And, I intend to be worth the trust. He stepped back from the lectern. The field marshal, behind him and 6 generations removed, stared out from his frame with his ship's brow jaw and his doubtless certainty. Edmund didn't look at him. He didn't need to. After the ceremony, when the formal part had concluded and the afternoon was loosening into something easier, I found Edmund standing in the garden, the kitchen garden, not the formal one. The kitchen garden was older and wilder, and the roses came up through the lavender with no regard for the topiarist's art, and Edmund had, I recalled, always preferred it to the exhibition garden his grandmother had installed in the 60s. He was holding a cup of tea. He handed me one when I walked up. He'd known I was coming. Well, I said. Well, he said. We stood there for a moment. The Wiltshire afternoon. Bees in the lavender. The sound of guests somewhere beyond the yew hedge, conversation and the specific clink of good glasses. The speech, I said. It was you. Yes, he said. Like, finally, yes. I drank my tea. The roses were early this year. Edmund would know why. He always knew the garden's reasons, a particular kind of red that didn't have a name in any catalog I'd seen, the kind of red that justifies itself. The field marshal, I said. Edmund glanced toward the hall. The window of the east corridor was visible from where we stood, though the portrait wasn't. I stopped trying to find him in myself, he said. About 2 years ago. Stopped looking for the overlap. Stopped measuring the gap. And I found I was a lot less tired. He said it simply. Not triumphantly. Just as a piece of information that had turned out to be true. The title still fits badly, he said. I expect it always will. But, he turned his cup in his hands. I think the bad fit might be useful. It means I can't go on autopilot. I have to keep choosing it. Every year, every decision. It can't just be gravity. Most people in your position rely on gravity, I said. Most people in my position end up in oil paint, he said, staring at their descendants. He said it without edge. More like, I've thought about this and reached a conclusion I'm comfortable with. Is that so bad? I said. If all I've done is fill a frame? He considered. Yes. I think so. In the years after the investiture, Edmund became, the word people reached for was unconventional. Which is the polite word for not what we expected, but we can't quite argue with the results. He restructured the estate's agricultural tendencies so that the farmers held longer terms and real equity stakes. He opened part of the hall to a residency program for artists and researchers. Specifically, he wanted people who were working on things with no guaranteed outcome, which he considered the best kind of work. He continued funding the food bank without attaching his name. He joined 3 parliamentary working groups that dealt with housing and land reform, which made certain of his hereditary peers profoundly uncomfortable. He also, to general surprise and his own evident amusement, wrote a short book about estate management, practical, unglamorous, full of things like dry rot and roof costs and the mathematics of keeping old things alive without turning them into museums. It sold modestly. He donated all of it to the food bank. None of this was the shape the title had historically taken. None of it was performative, either. That was the thing. It all had the texture of someone simply doing what they'd looked at and decided was right, with the resources they had, without waiting to see whether it matched the portrait. Margot's Otter project, as a footnote, she eventually went to Edinburgh for marine biology, spent 18 months in the Shetlands studying something to do with harbor seal cognition, and co-authored a paper that Edmund framed and hung in the Atlas Library. He did not hang it near the field marshal. He hung it near the atlases with the unlabeled coastlines, which was the right place for it. He told me this in a letter, still letters, still that particular handwriting, by then, familiar to me as my own, and added, she knows things about seals that I find genuinely moving. The field marshal knew things about troop movements. I consider this an improvement in the family's area of expertise. The last time I was at Ashford Hall, I stood alone in the East Corridor. The portraits. All of them. The field marshal in his gold frame, jaw set for eternity. And, at the far end of the corridor, recently hung, slightly smaller than the others, Edmund. Commissioned the previous year, oil on canvas, gold-leafed frame. Not in military dress. In the clothes he wore for working days at the estate, jacket, open collar, hands not at his sides but in his pockets. The painter had been someone from the artist residency, which some people found irregular and which Edmund had found entirely sensible. The expression in the portrait was not certainty. It was attention. It was the look of a person who is paying close attention to something you cannot see, and who is in the middle of deciding, and who has made their peace with the fact that deciding will always be the work, that it will never become automatic, that the gap between the person and the role is not a deficiency but a reminder. It was, I thought, the most honest portrait in the corridor. It was also the one that, if a 9-year-old boy stood in front of it, would look him level in the eye. And would not say, "I did not bend." It would say something harder and better. Something like, "I looked at all of this, the name, the weight, the history, the cost, and I chose it anyway. Not because I had to. Because I decided to." There's a difference. There is always a difference. He was raised to rule. He never felt like he belonged on a throne. He built something that didn't need one.